My name is Greg Gleason, and I was born in California, but grew up in Ogden, Utah. I had a normal family life, at least from my standpoint. I had a normal family life, and my parents always pushed their kids. I had a brother and a sister. Always pushed their kids to go to college. And before I went to college, I decided that I had to come up with an idea as what I should do with myself if I did go to college. And I came up with a conclusion that I wanted to be a dentist. So when I went to college, I always enjoyed animals and the like. So taking zoology classes, chemistry classes, physics classes kind of came as a natural for me, even though I didn't do very well. At the same time I started going to college, I became pretty much a full-time skier. And unfortunately for me, my skiing got in the way of my college. And so instead of studying for physics tests, I went skiing. And as a result, my college grades were not that good. And as many people know, to get into dental school and medical school, you have to have good college grades. And I realized by the time I was a sophomore in college that I wasn't going to have the grades to get me into dental school. But I was dumb enough to think that I should continue on with my zoology and chemistry and physics, even though I was not doing well in those classes. And so I finished out and ended up with a zoology degree and with a minor in chemistry. And then after I graduated, I asked myself, what does one do with a zoology degree and a chemistry minor other than teach, which wasn't something that I was interested in doing. I decided that I would basically turn into a ski bum, and for the next few years of my life did nothing but ski. And my parents continued to push me that I should do something with my degree and become a hard-working member of society, which was not what I was doing at the time. I was at the time working part-time at the IRS center in Ogden, Utah, that processes tax returns. I would work there in the evenings. So I'd ski all day and work for the IRS at night processing. I was actually in the microfilm research department, and we did, in those days, everything was on microfilm. So there'd be a request sent to the microfilm research for tax returns of some sort that was on microfilm, and of course, as a microfilm researcher, we would find whatever was needed and process it for whatever use was requested. And so while I was working there, and this was a couple years out of college, there was a notice on the bulletin board that there were some special agents from Las Vegas, Nevada, that were going to come up to interview for a entry-level position for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. It was what was called a tax fraud investigative aide, and it was a stepping stone to becoming a special agent at the time. And so I decided I wasn't not doing very well with my employment at the time. I'd actually gone down before that, had gone down to Salt Lake and interviewed with a headhunter agency. And I'll never forget, as I was telling them, they were interviewing me for what kind of jobs they would look for me. And I told him that I was, had a zoology degree, and the interviewer, kind of in a quizzical way, asked me, well, what does a zoologist do? Or what kind of job would a zoologist consider taking? And I think I said at the time that I would work some kind of job in a zoo. And they ended up finding me a position in the Humane Society as a cage cleaner at the dog pound. Obviously, I didn't take that job. I felt that with a college degree, that was below me. And so when this position came up in Las Vegas, I decided I would interview for the TFIA position in Las Vegas, thinking that I had no idea at the time what a special agent even was. And so I interviewed, and I'll never forget that one of the people that interviewed me, one of the agents that interviewed me, he was a supervisory agent in Las Vegas. And somehow it came out that I was a ski instructor. And he was more interested in my ski instructor ability than he was in my ability to do the job in Las Vegas as a TFIA. But for some reason, he kind of thought he wanted to hire me. And I was offered the job. Then the hard part was I had to move to Las Vegas, and away, obviously there isn't much skiing in Las Vegas. And so I ended up getting pushed into it, partly by my parents. And so the next thing I know, I moved to Las Vegas and became a TFIA, and found out that in order to become a special agent, I needed some more accounting skills, more accounting college classes. And so for the next year, that's what I did. I took night school at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And about a year after moving to Las Vegas, I got enough accounting to become a special agent. And I was still questioning whether I wanted to be a special agent. And because I remember thinking when I was working at the IRS Center in Ogden, that was working for the government was not something I wanted to do. And it was kind of like working in a factory in Ogden at the IRS Center, and I just had no interest in working for the government. And here I was working in Las Vegas and becoming a special agent and doing tax investigations for the IRS. And it's in one way it was kind of fulfilling. In another way, I still had the desire to do something more than investigate people for tax evasion. And so that same individual that hired me for the Las Vegas job had by then had gotten a job in Boise, Idaho as the head of the Idaho office that covered all of the state of Idaho. And he called me up one day and asked me if I was interested in coming to Boise, Idaho, a town that I had only visited once in my life. But I figured it got me closer to skiing. One of my most favorite ski resorts when I was skiing was Sun Valley. And I quickly realized that Boise, Idaho was an hour and a half drive to Sun Valley. And so at that point I had a wife and a small baby, and we picked up and moved to Boise, Idaho. And when I got to Boise, things were pretty much the same, tax investigations, and it was something that I really didn't enjoy doing. But yet at the same time, I had gained a skill in financial investigations, which I did enjoy. And it wasn't more than a year or two after moving to Boise that things started changing as far as the drug world. Drug investigations began to become an issue President Reagan had just become president, and he organized the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, which went after high-level drug traffickers. And I thought that would be a neat idea to get involved in that, and I became very involved in the beginning stages of the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force in Boise, Idaho. And I basically found a home. I realized that doing drug investigations was something that I almost was meant to be. Never knew it, but I enjoyed. It was kind of a game to me, going after individuals whose sole purpose was to traffic in drugs and find a way to get away from getting caught by law enforcement. And so it was a cat and mouse game that I enjoyed becoming involved in. And as a result, for the rest of my career, I started doing drug investigations for the Treasury Department. I consider myself a special agent for the Treasury Department, more so than a special agent for IRS criminal investigation, because most of what I did had nothing to do with the IRS or tax returns.
Hey Greg, before you go on and talk a little bit about what you did in your career, can you tell me what year did you start as a special agent with IRS?
I started with, I moved to Las Vegas in 1974 as a tax fraud investigative aide and became a special agent for IRS in Las Vegas in 1975. At that point in time, Las Vegas was undergoing a transition from all the casinos being owned by organized crime figures to the casinos slowly being purchased by corporations. And when I started down there in 1974, I witnessed the slow transition from mob-owned casinos to corporation-owned casinos. And there were 2 or 3 major casinos in those days that were still owned by the mob. And I found it very interesting that the IRS criminal investigation agents were still involved in investigating those casinos that were still owned by the mob. I remember doing surveillance on bagmen. They were called bagmen in those days. They were people that were sent out from back east to pick up money from the casinos to take back to the organized crime figures on the East Coast that actually owned the casinos. And I found that interesting, much more interesting than investigating mom and pop business people that were evading their taxes. So that was probably the beginning of my interest in investigating what I considered real criminals.
So when you started in Las Vegas as a special agent, can you kind of give an idea of what type of training you had to go through and what was your primary job as a special agent? Because most people don't know what special agents with the IRS do.
Well, back in those days, it was probably similar to what it is now. A good part of an agent's responsibility was to investigate individuals that were evading their taxes, knowingly evading their taxes by not reporting all of their income. For example, excuse me, the first case I was assigned as a brand new agent in Las Vegas was a sheriff's deputy that worked for the Metro, they called it the Metro Police Department in Las Vegas. It was a combination of sheriffs and Las Vegas PD. And he was a polygrapher. And he did polygraphs for the sheriff's department. But on the side, he had a second job. He would give polygraphs for casinos. And he was doubling his income as a sheriff's deputy working as a polygrapher for casinos. And there was one particular casino that he was working for on a regular basis, and literally just the money he was making from that one casino doubled his income as a sheriff's deputy. Well, that case was referred to the Criminal Investigation Unit, and I was the investigator for that case to investigate the fact, was there actually, was he truly making as much income as a polygrapher for a casino as he was as a sheriff's deputy, and in fact he was, and I recommended that he be prosecuted for tax evasion, which is what happened in that investigation. But even at that point, I was still felt, I don't know if the right word is uncomfortable, but I was looking for more in the sense of I didn't view him as a true criminal as opposed to the organized crime figures that owned still own some of the casinos in Las Vegas. So even back then, I was looking for something more than investigating tax cheats.
Okay, so you get to Boise, and
I forget to mention my training. You asked me about my training. The training for a special agent with IRS CI at that point, and probably still is the case, that required 3 separate training sessions that would total of approximately 6 to 8 months of training. My first recollection of going to training was I went to a 6-week course in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and it was entirely 5 days a week, 8 hours a day of tax law. And we were taught everything about tax law as it was at that point. And then I would come back. I went back to Las Vegas for a couple of months, and then was sent to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, which had just opened. I was one of the first classes that was sent to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, and which is now trains most special agents in the federal government except for the FBI and the DEA. All other agents, special agents in federal law enforcement, are trained in Glencoe, Georgia. And I spent 2 months, my recollection, at least 2 months in Glencoe on the next training session that told us all about being a law enforcement officer, from everything from shooting to search warrants and everything that you would connect to law enforcement. We were taught in that 2.5 month period in Glencoe. And then I went back to Las Vegas and spent a few months, and then was sent to one other additional course again at Glencoe, Georgia. And in that course we were taught financial investigations generally, how to conduct financial investigations, for everything from investigating what was considered what we called net worth, trying to figure out what an individual's net worth was, and how an individual's net worth increased, and what was the cause of the increase in a person's net worth. If a person is involved in illegal activity, he's involved in illegal activity usually for one reason and one reason only, and that is to make money. And so we were taught that when a person is involved in illegal activity, they do it to make money, and they do it to create a better lifestyle for themselves. And by creating a better lifestyle for themselves, that causes an increase in their net worth. So that is one way that the government looks at people involved in illegal activities, is where did the money come to increase their net worth? And that's one of the things we were taught in that last training course at Glencoe, Georgia. So in total, it was about 6 to 8 months of training, to become a special agent.
Okay. All right. And so then you get transferred up to Boise, and how does your career progress from there?
It started out just like it was in Vegas. I was assigned mom and pop tax investigations. And it was something that I did but wasn't completely satisfied in doing. And then, as I mentioned, when President Reagan became president in the early 1980s, he started an emphasis on drug investigations, and that is what I became ultimately involved in and remained involved in for the rest of my law enforcement career. In fact, I'm still somewhat involved in the sense that I'm still work for the Idaho State Police and do consulting work for them as far as financial investigations.
Okay. Can you talk about some of the interesting cases that you investigated over the years that people might be surprised of sitting here in, I guess for lack of a better term, small town Idaho versus a Los Angeles or a New York?
In the early stages of in the early 1980s, in the early stages of drug investigations, I felt that things were not the same in Boise, Idaho as they were in Los Angeles, and I knew that. But I wanted I wanted Las Vegas or Los Angeles type investigations to be done in Boise, Idaho, but the key was finding those people that are worthy of investigations that you might find in Los Angeles. And so I slowly started looking at where the money was in Idaho and realized that the big money in Idaho happened to be in Sun Valley and in northern Idaho in the Coeur d'Alene area. And so I started looking at the Sun Valley area as a potential for cases that might people living in Sun Valley that were doing illegal activities in other parts of the country, and amazingly found that was happening. I found that there were a number of individuals living in Sun Valley that were from other parts of the country. Many were from California. Others were from actually foreign countries. There was one individual that I can think of that was from Canada that lived in Sun Valley, and he was involved in, all of these people were involved in, at the time, drug trafficking, and found that there were Los Angeles type cases in Idaho, but you just had to go find them.
And so what type of cases would those be? I mean, back in the 80s, obviously, we had a whole bunch of cocaine and large marijuana smuggling. What type of cases did you actually find?
I found that, at least in those days, and in some ways it's still true, that there was more money to be made in the marijuana business than the cocaine business. In the cocaine business, there were so many people involved in what was called in those days the farm to arm, from the growing of the coca plants to the sale on the streets of cocaine, that there were so many people that were taking their cut of the profits in cocaine, but that by the time the cocaine got to Idaho, the people making the most money didn't live in Idaho. On the other hand, with marijuana, I found that people that were involved in large-scale marijuana trafficking actually did live in Idaho. And in fact, there was quite a few people that were living in Sun Valley that didn't originate from Sun Valley, but were doing smuggling, international drug smuggling, but yet they still lived in Sun Valley.
Can you talk about any of those investigations?
There was one particular investigation that had a interesting beginning, in the sense that one day I was called by the chief of police in Ketchum, Idaho, and I had a relationship with him for a while, because I had come to the conclusion that there was major cases to be made in Sun Valley. And he called me and said that one of his officers had recently had a female, come to him about her husband. And it was a typical divorce situation where the husband and wife had been fighting over the kids and the money for quite a bit of time. And the husband had drugged the wife through the mud during the divorce, and the wife was looking for a way to get even with the husband. So she came to the Ketchum Police Department to tell her story about why she was there and what her husband and she had been involved in for a number of years. And she told the story to this officer, who called me and thought that it would be something that I should talk to her about. So I drove up to Sun Valley and spent quite a bit of time with this female, who told me that she had in a few years before talking to me was living in Southern California, and her husband had gotten involved with an organization of drug smugglers, marijuana smugglers, and they were making millions of dollars a year smuggling Thai marijuana out of Southeast Asia and bringing it into the West Coast and selling it for millions of dollars. They would buy marijuana in Thailand for pennies on the dollar, in the sense of for a few dollars you could buy a pound of marijuana, and for that same pound of marijuana they could sell it in Southern California for thousands of dollars. And the only problem they had was getting the marijuana from Thailand to Southern California. Most of these guys were all surfers that had traveled the world looking for the perfect wave, and that's how they found Thailand, is through their surfing. And they realized that if they could find a way to get marijuana from Thailand to California, they could make a lot of money. And so, because their life was the ocean, they knew people that had sailboats. And so they quickly realized that a 50-foot sailboat, you could put a ton of marijuana on a 50-foot sailboat, and that few $1,000 investment in Thailand could turn into a multi-million-dollar investment in Southern California. So they started smuggling Thai marijuana from Southeast Asia to Southern California, and literally on one load of marijuana could make millions of dollars. And so this lady that I spoke to in Sun Valley told me this story, that her husband was a builder by profession in Southern California, and had come in contact with these marijuana smugglers who were looking for ways to get rid of their money, to launder their money. And so they come up with the idea that these smugglers would give these large sums of cash to this home builder. This home builder would build homes in Southern California and sell the homes, therefore thereby laundering the money through the sale of homes that he would build. So he'd build the homes with the smugglers' cash, and then sell them and return the cash to the smugglers for a fee. And this lady would tell me how in Southern California Her job was to go from bank to bank with a briefcase full of cash, converting the cash to cashier's checks at banks. Back in those days, there weren't the kind of money laundering controls placed on banks that there are now. And she would go into a bank with a briefcase full of money and literally buy thousands of dollars worth of cashier's checks. She would take the cashier's checks back to her husband, who would use the cashier's checks to buy building materials to build the house. And these people were, her husband ended up being a major money launderer for these drug smugglers in Southern California. They realized that there was a better way to live than down in Southern California, because they liked the surfing world. And so that was the beginning of the snowboarding craze, where instead of skiing, people were snowboarding. And so these surfers realized that they were a natural at snowboarding because they were surfers. So they moved to Sun Valley to snowboard and live. And they could live a very good lifestyle in Sun Valley with all their millions of dollars, but yet do all their illegal activities in Southern California and Southeast Asia. And so she told me the story of how she moved to Ketchum with her husband, and she continued to launder money by taking large sums of cash to various banks in Idaho. The only difference between Idaho and Southern California was there wasn't as many banks. So she had to do a lot more driving between banks than she did when she was in Southern California. She would go to Twin Falls, she would go to Gooding, she would come to Boise and do the same thing, but just required a lot more effort to launder, to convert cash to cashier's checks. So she told me that she would take these cashier's checks back to her husband in Sun Valley, and her husband had started doing the same thing in Sun Valley as he was doing in Southern California. And in fact, she told me that a athletic club in Sun Valley had been built entirely with proceeds from marijuana trafficking. And so the first thing I had to do was, her story was so hard to believe that I had to verify that she was telling me the truth. And so she told me some bank accounts that she used where some of these cashier's checks were deposited. So we proceeded to subpoena some of these bank accounts to determine whether we did in fact find cashier's checks in some of these bank accounts. And long story short, the amazing thing is we found bank accounts that had nothing but thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of cashier's checks deposited into these construction accounts that were used by her husband to build large million-dollar houses and big buildings. And so that was the beginning of that investigation that literally lasted for years, that took us around the world, tracing millions of dollars in drug money that were deposited in various locations around the world, because these individuals knew they had to be careful with what they did with their money. They just couldn't deposit it, these large sums of cash, into a Sun Valley bank account. And so the investigation took me to basically the money capitals of the world, from Switzerland to Hong Kong to Southeast Asia, and to Los Angeles. Everywhere you find a lot of banking activities, that's where these people did their banking.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship that you had with prosecutors that would help you with these cases?
when I first started with the financial crimes investigations as it relates to narcotics trafficking, I quickly realized that the involvement of a prosecutor that was interested in doing such a thing was extremely important. And so I actually had to go start looking for people, attorneys, that were interested in doing those kinds of investigations. Even back then, drug attorneys, prosecutors, the main thing they did in those days was what we would call buy-bust investigations. A law enforcement officer would buy drugs from an individual, and that individual was prosecuted for the drugs that were purchased undercover or whatever way that could be proven that he was selling drugs. Usually the first thing was done that drugs would be purchased from the trafficker, and that was used as evidence in the prosecution. And that's what primarily narcotics traffickers, drug attorneys would know how to do, is just a buy-bust investigation. So finding attorneys that were interested in doing long-term, what I came to call no-dope conspiracies, drug conspiracies, you had to find attorneys that were interested in doing those kind of things. And so yes, it was sometimes difficult to find attorneys that were interested in doing those kind of investigations.
When did you retire from the IRS?
I retired from the IRS in 2006. When I turned 57 in 2006, it was mandatory that all federal agents retire at the age of 57. So I was retired in 2006 at the age of 57, but immediately continued to work for the Justice Department and basically doing the same thing as a contractor.
And so one thing you kind of hit on that I'm a little bit interested in, and maybe it hasn't changed at all, but from the time you started with IRS until even now as a consultant, have you noticed the types of crimes specifically that you've been investigating? Have they differed at all? Have they gotten smaller? Have they gotten larger?
I hate to say that the emphasis on narcotics investigations in general, from what I have seen, and being still involved in a small degree in drug investigations even to this day, what I have seen is that there seems to be a de-emphasis placed on narcotics investigations, even though this country, in my opinion, is awash with drugs, illegal drugs, fentanyl being the primary drug now, that there is such a legalization effort underway throughout the country to de-emphasize the crime in narcotics and to basically legalize as much narcotics as possible. For example, in the state of Oregon, I believe that they have basically legalized all forms of narcotics in use amounts. Now, they still prosecute large quantities of narcotics, but as far as general illegality of narcotics, it is not the way it used to be. And as a result, I think I've noticed that prosecutors have moved on to other types of crimes, and that narcotics investigations in general, both from the federal, state, and local level, have been de-emphasized.
I want to take a little bit of a different tack here with you now. So in all the times that you were a law enforcement officer, I believe you were married. So in all that time, two questions. Do you think being a law enforcement officer affected your family life at all? And did it affect your views on society and people in general?
It absolutely did. First on the family. I, to this day, have regrets of how much time my job took me away from my family. I, I have 4 children, 4 grown children now, and during the height of my career, they were young children, and I found myself traveling quite a bit. My wife and I, to this day, still talk about the fact that I was gone for long periods of time. Some of my overseas trips took me away for weeks on end, and when I would travel to Sun Valley, I would be gone for maybe a week at a time. And when I would travel to northern Idaho, the same. And so, and I often traveled to Southern California because that's where a lot of the actual the drugs ended up is in Southern California. So my traveling took me away from my family, and I, to this day, regret the amount of time that I spent away from my family. And did my job taint my view of the world? I'll never forget interviewing in the later part of my career. My involvement in drug investigations changed from marijuana to cocaine and other harder drugs. And in the beginning in the 1990s and early 2000s, cocaine and methamphetamine and the like were basically started to be controlled by Mexican cartels. And so I found myself more involved with the Hispanic community than I was during the marijuana days. And I'll never forget an interview that I did, and she was an accountant, a Hispanic accountant. And I ended up interviewing her because she was an accountant for 3 or 4 what I consider to be major drug traffickers, Hispanic drug traffickers that lived here in Idaho. And the purpose of my interview was to try to understand why she knowingly, based on the investigation and what I saw on her tax returns, she knew what she was doing in the standpoint of hiding their money as best she could, helping them hide their money as best she could. And I flat out asked her, why she was doing what she was doing for these people that I don't think she really cared for that much, but yet worked for from the standpoint of helping them with their finances. And what she told me was that because they were Hispanic, that it was almost the downtrodden Hispanic community needed help. And that was her way of helping the Hispanic community by helping people that were involved in drug smuggling. And it kind of opened my eyes and kind of tainted my view of the hard-working Hispanic community to a degree, in the sense that I found so many people that were willing, otherwise honest Hispanic people, that were willing to turn their heads and not want to help law enforcement in investigating major Hispanic drug traffickers.
So do you think, after all those years, do you think you became jaded at all towards people in general doing these type of investigations?
Yes, I'm sorry to say that I became a little jaded in the sense that I did so many interviews of so many people in so many places around the world, and so many of these people ended up lying to me. and I feel like I was able to reach the conclusion that they were lying to me through evidence that I had, financial evidence that I had, and yet they would look me right in the eye and try to tell me that the truth was false and that false was true. And it had a tendency to cause me to be skeptical of everything I heard from everybody. And so I found myself questioning people that might be otherwise telling me the truth, because I became so skeptical of what people told me.
How do you view your career now? Now that you're done with IRS, you're still consulting, but how do you think your career went?
Oh, I think I had considering that I had no interest in becoming involved in law enforcement in the beginning, I believe I had a career that I will look back on and say that I was so extremely fortunate to have done the things that I did, and to have been able to hopefully done something for this country and our community as far as trying to keep drugs off the street. Unfortunately, I believe that the war that we fought, the war on drugs that we had started in the early 1980s and continued into the 90s and maybe even into the early 2000s, I hate to say has been lost. We are awash with drugs now that comes across our southern border, and I look back and see that things are worse now than they were when I started in the early 80s. And I will have to say that one of Nancy Reagan's big pushes was to just say no in the schools. That was her motto: just say no to the school children, say no to drugs. And I questioned whether that was going to do any good, and I look back on it now and I think that there was some good coming from the just say no policy in our schools, because and unfortunately that has been abandoned, and with this legalization idea of many of our politicians, I think our school problems of our children is greater now than it ever has been. I see the news where in some of the bigger cities, kids 10 and 12 years old coming to school high, and that wasn't the case in the 1980s when I first got involved in this. And so that's why I say we've lost the war, in the sense that it's worse now than it ever was in the 1980s.
But overall, you do look back fondly on your career.
Absolutely. I feel that I was extremely fortunate to have picked the career that I did, even though it kind of picked me, and that I got involved in the things that I did get involved in, and that I wouldn't change anything.
Greg, thank you for talking to me. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.